Hello, my name is Esther Bell, and I'm the Robert and Martha Berman Lip Chief Curator at the Clark Art Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome you today to our virtual program featuring Heather Bruegl, Director of Education for Forge Project and a citizen of the United Nation of Wisconsin and first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. This program has been made possible in part by a grant from Mass Humanities, which provided funding through the National Endowment for the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan. Today's event is the last in a series in conjunction with the exhibition Groundwork, which is installed on the Clark's 140-acre campus and closes tomorrow. And if you haven't seen it yet, or if you have, I hope you'll come back in these last hours. And before I introduce Heather Bruegl, I would like to share the Clark's land acknowledgement with you. The Clark Art Institute sits on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people. We acknowledge the tremendous hardship of their forcible removal from these homelands by colonial settlers. A federally recognized nation, they now reside in Wisconsin and are known as the Stockbridge-Munsee Community. As we learn, speak, and gather here, we pay honor to their ancestors, past and present, and to future generations by committing to build a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And thank you everyone for joining us, and particularly Heather Bruegl. Heather is a graduate of Madonna University in Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in U.S. History. Inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, a passion for Native American history was born. She has spoken for numerous groups, including the University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the College of the Mohican Nation. She has spoken at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh for Indigenous Peoples Day in 2017, and she spoke at the Women's March Anniversary in Lansing, Michigan in January of 2018. She also spoke at the first ever Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C. in January of 2019. In the summer of 2019, virtually in 2020 and in 2021, she delivered lectures at the Crazy Horse Memorial and Museum in Custer, South Dakota for their Talking Circle series. She has become, in her own words, an accidental activist and speaks to different groups about intergenerational racism and trauma, and helps to bring awareness to our environment, the fight for clean water, and other issues in the Native community. A curiosity of her own heritage led her to Wisconsin, where she has researched the history of the Native American tribes in the area. She is the former Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee Community and now serves as the Director of Education for Forge Project. In addition to this work, she currently travels and speaks on Native American history, including policy and activism. I'd also like to add that Heather is the lead curator of an exhibition currently on view at the Berkshire Museum in Pittsfield called Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok, The People of the Waters That Are Never Still. This exhibition will be on view until January 9th, and it movingly traces the journey of this region's first residents from their lands that stretched from the Hudson River Valley to Berkshire County through forced removal from these lands by white colonizers to their current home in Wisconsin. Along the way, visitors encounter historical and current day topics, discover actions they can take to be better allies to Indigenous people worldwide, and unlearn harmful misconceptions and stereotypes. And I conclude these brief remarks with a quote featured in this exhibition from a speech given by John Winnewacan Quinney on July 4th, 1854. And he said, "For a wise purpose, for myself and for my tribe, I ask for justice. I believe it will sooner or later occur, and may the Great Spirit enable me to die in hope." And I'm delighted to have Heather here with us today. And Heather, I pass it over to you for your lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you so much to the Clark Museum. I want to do a couple of things, housekeeping things first. During our practice session, we did notice that my internet was a little bit lagging. So if I turn my video off, it's because I want to make sure I have a better connection with you guys, but I'll go slow and hopefully everything will just work out fine. Second, I want to acknowledge the land that I'm coming to you from today is the ancestral homelands of my ancestors, the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok, the people of the waters that are never still. I'm currently in upstate New York, just outside Hudson, and in front of me is a beautiful window and I can overlook the mountains, and it's just very awe-inspiring to know that my ancestors walked along this land lived along this land, and lived life, and it's very exciting to be here. I'm new to the area. I just moved, and when I say I just moved, I mean I arrived yesterday, and so I am a little tired, but super excited to be able to talk to you about something that I'm passionate about. I'm a historian first. And so one of the things I love to do is to talk about the Indigenous history, whether it's of certain groups of people, whether it's events. And this one is a particular favorite of mine because it obviously covers the history of my ancestors. Not the Last of the Mohicans, obviously, is a play on the novel written by James Fenimore Cooper, Last of the Mohicans. I figured I would kind of take that term back because we are not the last of the Mohicans. And so it's very important to acknowledge that. So I'm going to go through this lecture. We'll do a little Q&A, and then hopefully I can, answer any questions or comments that you might have. So the photo that you see here is a big sign that sits at the entrance to one of our main roads on the reservation in Wisconsin. And so I just thought it was appropriate for this because while we are federally known as Stockbridge-Munsee Community, we are Mohican Nation. And so it's very important to know that. Move along here, just get my slide. There we go. Okay, so Mohican Munsee territory. Where was it? What did it encompass? So the territory covered about 6 states, from southwest Vermont, the entire Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok River Valley, which you know is the Hudson River Valley of New York, from Lake Champlain to Manhattan, which you know is Manhattan, western Massachusetts up to the Connecticut River Valley, northwest Connecticut, and portions of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. There were also some settlements in Kansas as well, and we'll talk about that briefly later on. Now, the map on here shows the territory that is historically Mohican and Munsee. Why Munsee? And we'll talk about that later on. But when we first moved to Wisconsin, a group of Munsee Lenape people joined with us. And so when we talk about our ancestral homelands, we talk about that in context of the Munsee territory as well. So if you look at the photo on here and you look at the map, that top oval that you see, where you see Albany, Stockbridge, Massachusetts, you see the Berkshires in there, and you see it go up to parts of Lake Champlain in Vermont. That is Mohican territory. The circle underneath it, where you see New York City highlighted, and you see parts of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, that is Munsee. So when we talk about our homelands, we're talking about this whole general area. And it's important to note that. And then for me personally, being an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation, if I go just outside those boundaries, I'm in my Oneida and Haudenosaunee ancestral homelands. So moving back, not moving back. Well, yeah, moving back, even though I've never lived here, my ancestors have lived here. So moving back to the area is just really significant because no matter where I go, I'm walking on the land of my ancestors, and that's really significant. And it's important to note this land because the community clearly is not located here anymore, right? The seat of government now sits in Wisconsin, but it's important to have an understanding of where we came from because we, in fact, do still come back here. So that's important to know. Who are the Stockbridge-Munsee? We are the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok. We are the people of the waters that are never still. We settled along the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok, which is the river that flows both ways. We were dominant in the area along the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok River. We numbered around 25,000 or more. We had a central council fire at Schodack Island, as well as in Albany. And when we say central council fire, that's where your seat of government lies. So if you were to ask me where our central council fire is now, I would say it's in Bowler, Wisconsin, because that's where it is. So that's where your seat of government lies. And we're 25,000, numbered in 25,000 souls or more. We're not exactly sure, but we know 25,000 for sure. That's a huge, huge number. It's important to note, too, that prior to the arrival of Columbus in 1492, Indigenous people covered this entire continent from anywhere between 10 to 100 million people. right? That is so important to note that number one, Columbus was lost. Number two, he didn't discover anything. And number three, it wasn't new because there were already millions of people living here. We were closely aligned with the Lenape who lived downriver, as you saw from the previous map. We referred to them as grandfathers, and they would help us when we needed it, and we would help them when we needed and when they needed it. So it was that really close aligning of that. And you'll see in our name, Stockbridge-Munsee, that we do end up joining forces. And when we talk about the removal of the Lenape, while the main Lenape tribes went to Oklahoma and Canada, we're included in that as well because Munsee Lenape did travel with us. So when we talk about the Trail of Tears, the removal, you've got Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Canada when it comes to the Munsee people. So that's important to note. There were a series of land agreements, in quotes, we want to put that in quotes, throughout the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok River homelands, where we were forced into giving up plots of land. There were land cessions that were made. It was something of the reason I have agreement in quotes, is because what were we really agreeing to? We thought we were sharing the land. It's the same with the Lenape when they lost Manhattan. We thought we were sharing the land with the Dutch. We didn't realize the Dutch were pushing us out completely. But nevertheless, we stood strong. We became a nation of diplomats, and we continued to carry our history and our tradition with us. We were not the first Indigenous group of people to encounter explorers, but we were Christianized pretty early on with colonization. The first encounter that we have is in 1609 with Henry Hudson, as he sailed up the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok, the river that now bears his name, to the land of the Mohicans. By 1614, a fur trading post was established at Castle Island. When we have encounters with explorers, our way of life for Indigenous people, no matter if it was the Wampanoags with the Pilgrims or us with the Dutch, way of life changed completely. We were never going to be the same again. And then when you introduce trade, in particular fur trade, things change even more. So what ended up happening is in 1628, we had the Beaver Wars with the Mohawks, who were increasingly dominant in the fur trade in the area. The Beaver Wars were a battle for economic dominance in the area. Who was going to have the monopoly on the fur trade? Who was going to get to the Dutch first? Who was going to make the most money? Now, this is really important because with those encounters with the fur traders, again, like I said, way of life changed. So you were starting to come out of the traditional way that you did things, and you were doing things differently in almost a more capitalistic sort of way. And now you were reliant upon those goods, reliant upon the funding that you received for providing said goods in order to feed your family and your community. So it was really important. In 1628, the Mohawk defeated the Mohicans and pushed them east of the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok, thus creating a monopoly of trade with the Dutch in the New Netherland. The fur trade, however, also brought a decline in the beaver population, and the animal all but disappeared from the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok River Valley by 1640. Economic way of life for the Mohicans changed with contact. Traditional items were no longer being made. New items such as iron kettles, cloth, guns, and colorful glass beads were now available. This created a dependency on these goods and thus a paternalistic relationship between Native nations, and some form of government is formed. And I say some form of government because the United States did not exist at the time of colonization. You had the Dutch, you had the English, then you had the United States. So that relationship transferred with each colonial power. There was forced movement. Along with any Native nation, the Mohicans were not exempt from this. The Mohicans were eventually driven from their territory west of the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok. In the early 1700s, the Mohicans moved further east near the Housatonic River in present-day Connecticut. The English now replaced the Dutch in the area and aimed at making natives civilized. They created boundaries and fences when land was shared with Native people. They didn't even want to share land with us. They wanted to still shut us out of our land because we were savages, quote unquote. We were not civilized enough to interact with white people. One of the most infamous boundaries that was put up was actually Wall Street. Wall Street was erected as a literal wall to shut out the Lenape people. And it starts showing up on maps in the late 1600s. You start to see it on maps in the late 1600s. And so today, if you are in Manhattan and you are walking down Wall Street, know that you are walking down a boundary that literally shut my ancestors out. It's important to understand that. And since lands were declared to belong to the Europeans by the, quote, right of discovery, the Mohicans couldn't defend their ownership in the courts of the colonists. Right of discovery, the doctrine of discovery are kind of the same thing. They go hand in hand. It's basically if I were to walk into a piece of land and say, I discovered this, this is now mine. That's kind of how it went. And since the Native people were not considered people, they weren't able to dispute these claims in the courts of the colonists because there was no one to represent them, and everyone was out to get something for themselves. As more settlers arrived, the Mohicans became dependent on the settlers in order to survive. Again, we're going back to the inception of trade and getting these new items in, giving up your traditional way of life and becoming dependent on something that that you think might be profitable in order to feed your family and your community. But also, with the arrival of colonists, disease also arrived. Smallpox, measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever were just a few of the diseases that arrived in I was going to say the New World, but I caught myself, in the indigenous Americas. And we did not have immunity to these diseases. We did not have any way to build a tolerance to these diseases because they were foreign to us. They didn't exist in our world. And so we were unfamiliar with these diseases, and hundreds of thousands and sometimes entire villages were wiped out by diseases. There is a really good documentary that I recommend that you watch. It's called We Shall Remain. You can get it on PBS. And in one of the early episodes, they talk about the arrival of the Europeans, the colonists, and their encounters with the Wampanoag, and walking through entire villages that seemed to have been abandoned, but they weren't really abandoned. It was entire villages that were wiped out by disease. And so it was very detrimental. The indigenous population dropped dramatically in the years following the first steps of colonization because we did not have immunity to these diseases. We were not familiar with these diseases. So Stockbridge, Massachusetts plays a significant role in Stockbridge-Munsee history. Yeah, I know the Clark is located in Williamstown, which is also part of our ancestral homelands and is significant in our history, but Stockbridge seems to hold a special place. So missionaries arrived and soon entered the native villages to help convert Native people. The goal was to convert us to Christianity. Native people agreed to be Christianized after seeing the prosperity of the settlers. A lot of them also converted to survive. They felt perhaps that the God of the colonists was more powerful. And within this, Stockbridge, Massachusetts plays a significant role in the Stockbridge-Munsee history. In 1734, a missionary named John Sargent came to the Mohicans in the village of Wautukook. He preached to and baptized many Mohicans, and they started to take on Christian names such as John, Rebecca. In 1738, the Mohicans gave John permission to start a mission in the village. It's located on the Housatonic River near a great meadow, bounded right by the Berkshire Mountains. And so he built the mission house, which was located on Prospect Hill. It's now on Main Street. It was moved. It's now on Main Street in Stockbridge. And we also curated an exhibit there as well called Mohican Miles. I encourage you to go see it if you're able to. As more settlers moved into the area, the Mohican village was renamed Stockbridge after a time in England. Other Native groups who wished to hear the mission's teachings also came to Stockbridge. This included the Wappingers, the Brothertons, the Pequots, the Mohawk, the Narragansett, and the Oneidas. These groups merged with the Mohicans, so to speak, and then we were just called Stockbridge Indians. So I don't know if it was too difficult to refer to this group over here as Oneida, and this group over here as Mohican, and this group over here as Mohawk. They just lumped us all together, and we were called Stockbridge Indians. So that's how the Stockbridge part of our name comes to be. There was a meeting house and many other significant locations within the town that are important to Stockbridge history, and they include several significant documents. Again, there's a lot of significance and a lot of our history takes place in Stockbridge. I would say it seems to be when most of our great diplomats seem to rise. You can go to the Stockbridge Library or the Stockbridge Archives and look at documents that have been signed by our ancestors that deal with land rights, that deal with land use. It's pretty significant. And you can also go to the mission house, obviously, and tour the mission house and tour the carriage house where we curated Mohican Miles. I had my first visit to the mission house over this past summer to finish curating that exhibit there. And I have to tell you, it was a really heavy feeling walking into the mission house. It was just like this immense, like great sadness came over me as I walked in, knowing what happened there, knowing of the forced Christianization, forced conversion of my ancestors. It was really difficult, and but I respect the mission house for telling that story and not shying away from that. So I appreciate that very, very much. Mohicans, as well as many other Native nations, were involved in many wars from before the inception of the United States through even today. And as a current figure, Native Americans today serve at a higher rate per capita than any other ethnic group in the US military today. So that's important to note. There were several wars between 1700 and 1800 that happened that the Mohicans were caught up in every single one. The French and Indian War was a conflict between France and England over territory that was taken from Native people. The American Revolution was a war about creating a new nation on stolen land. The War of 1812 saw Native nations who once fought on the side of the Patriots now fighting against them in order to retain some sort of homelands. So you had a lot going on within the wars and a lot of things happening. So for example, my Oneida and Mohican ancestors fought on the side of the Patriots, but the Lenape fought on the side of the colonists, the Redcoats, the British. So it's very interesting to see. And then you'll see other tribes during the War of 1812 kind of switch sides, right? So they fought for the Patriots beforehand, but then they fight for the British during the War of 1812. During the American Revolution, the Stockbridge Mohicans, Oneidas, Tuscarora, and other Native nations fought alongside the colonists. The Mohicans were very instrumental in this war. Between 1775 and 1783, the Stockbridge Indian companies served in the Siege of Boston, the Battle of Saratoga, and the Battle of Kingsbridge in the Bronx. In 1783, George Washington held an ox roast for the Mohicans as a thank you for serving in the war, and he held this in Stockbridge. And even before the Mohicans could return from war, much of their land had already been taken in Stockbridge. So they went off to fight. The Stockbridge militia went off to fight. They come back. Some come back to the area. There's this ox roast that happens with George Washington because the Stockbridge militia served under George Washington. So he's like, thank you for your work. We couldn't have done it without you. Now you guys have to leave. And so that's kind of what happened. And the Stockbridge-Munsee Community Historic Preservation Office is currently doing some really cool work in Stockbridge, in the area, to uncover the site of that ox roast. And so I encourage you to follow them on social media because they're doing some really amazing work to find out where that site is. But it's important to note that we fought for freedom for the new United States, and we were then forced out of our lands. So it's important to note that. So after leaving Stockbridge, we moved to New Stockbridge near Oneida Lake. The Oneida who fought in the war with the Stockbridge offered them a portion of their farmland and forest, and the Stockbridge accepted. The tribe flourished in the area. Mary Dockstader and other women started a spinning school enterprise, growing by 1850 to involve 60 Stockbridge Mohican women and girls. A grist mill and school were erected in the new village. In 1791 to 1793, Chief Hendrik Oppermott served as a peace commissioner. He represented the nation in the Ohio River Valley among traditional relations with the Lenape and the Shawnee and other tribes that were part of the United Indian Nations Confederacy that sought to maintain territory independent of U.S. and British Canada. So Tecumseh was really instrumental in leading a group of Indigenous people to fight against the United States in order to retain the Ohio River Valley area for Indigenous people. And that's why during the War of 1812, a lot of those tribes fight against the United States and fight on the side of the British. So the move to New Stockbridge was just the beginning. We ended up moving to White River, Indiana in 1890 to live with the Miami and the Lenape that were there. When we arrived after a year of travel, we discovered that the Lenape had been coerced into selling the land. So we had no place to live. We were basically couch surfing. So this particular move was led by John Metoxen, and it took about a year. And John Sargent, who was the missionary in Stockbridge, wrote in his journal, about a third of my church and a fourth of the tribe, about 70 souls, started from this place to White River. While we were in White River, tribal leaders in New York were negotiating for new lands in Wisconsin, and hopefully the last of our moves. So back in New York, people from the War Department, where Indian Affairs was housed, were negotiating with the Menominee and Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin. A treaty was reached in 1822, and the Stockbridge moved again, this time to settle along Kaukauna, which was along the Fox River, and many who were in New York left and joined the tribe there in Kaukauna. They were perhaps the first English-speaking people in the area. Electa Quinney was the first public school teacher. We had the first Protestant minister and the first Christian temperance union. But being, quote, civilized didn't mean you were going to be able to stay. As long as you were Indian, you could always be moved. The Fox River became a major waterway, so once again, the Stockbridge were moved to the east shore of Lake Winnebago in 1834. This is where a group of Munsee Lenape joined them, and the whole group then becomes known as the Stockbridge-Munsee Community or Indians. So that's important to know. So that's how our name came to be. Stockbridge because we were all dubbed Stockbridge Indians, and then Munsee when the Munsee Lenape joined us when we were in Stockbridge, Wisconsin. The federal government under Andrew Jackson was forcing removal and land cessions. A group of Stockbridge Mohicans who feared the inevitable moved to Indian Territory in 1839. Many died along this journey. Some reached Kansas and Oklahoma and married into other tribes. Others gave up and moved back to Wisconsin when it gained statehood in 1848. There were a lot of policies that were happening that did affect the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And so first you have the Congressional Act of 1843, which made the Stockbridge citizens of the United States. On paper, that sounds good. In reality, it's bad, and this is why. divided up the land that the nation had at Lake Winnebago. In addition, it also caused an internal conflict which divided the nation into the Citizen Party and the Indian Party. The Indian Party stated that this congressional act stripped them of their rights to be Indian. So what the Congressional Act of 1843 did is it made Stockbridge people citizens of the United States and took away that indigenous tribal sovereignty. So that is not a good thing. So we then have the Congressional Act of 1848. And what this does is it reverses the Act of 1843. This became a concern when non-Native people began to take advantage of those who were in the Citizen Party, who were all for citizenship, and started to buy up all the land around them. It reinstated the right to be a sovereign nation, and it also reimbursed the nation for improvements made to the land and held the money in trust to gain interest. The tribe was on the move again. The Treaty of 1856 established a reservation for the Stockbridge-Munsee Community in northeast Wisconsin in Shawano County in the townships of Bartlemy and Red Springs. Farming was attempted, but the land was sandy and swampy. Forestry became the base of the economy, but outsiders came in and cleared the land. In 1871, the tribe was forced to sell off 54 sections of land to survive. And I know John Quinney was super instrumental in having the Congressional Act of 1843 reversed and having the Act of 1848 come to light. And so I know that Esther read a bit of his quote at the beginning, and I just wanted to expand on that a little bit more. He was a great diplomat. He traveled to Washington, D.C. numerous times, and he delivered a speech on July 4th, 1854, in Reidsville, New York. And his end of the speech says, "Let it not surprise you, my friends, when I say that the spot on which we stand has never been purchased or rightly obtained, and that by justice, human and divine, it is the property now of the remnant of that great people from whom I'm descended. They left in the tortures of starvation and to improve their miserable existence. These events are not above our comprehension, and for wise purposes. For myself and for my tribe, I ask justice. I believe it will sooner or later occur, and may the great and good spirit enable me to die in hope." And again, that was delivered in July 4th, 1854 in Reidsville, New York. The speech is also, if you read his speech in the entirety, he says a lot of harsh truths. And it's been equated sometimes to the 4th of July speech given by Frederick Douglass on what is the 4th of July to a Black man. In essence, what is the 4th of July to an Indigenous person? I haven't celebrated the 4th of July in a really long time. So it's important to know that. But John Quinney was a great leader. He was one of our sachems, which is what we call our leaders, but he was also a really good diplomat as well. So just really important to know that. Sorry. So the Treaty of 1856 established the reservation that we have today in the townships of Red Springs and Bartlemy. The area, like I said, was rich in timber, like it was covered in timber, but lumber barons came in to strip the land. And by the 1930s, the Stockbridge-Munsee were left virtually landless, and much of the land had been stripped of timber. Like it was just clear cut, it was gone. There was nothing sustainable about this forestry at all. So finally, we are able to develop a constitution and federal Indian policies that are able to help us. So federal policies had started to take a toll on Native nations. You had removal, allotment, other policies as well. And with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, or the IRA, what it did is it stopped the policy of allotment, and it made it possible for tribes to form their own governments. In 1937, a new constitution was written based on the model from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And now there was a land base to build homes on. The Stockbridge-Munsee Community regained 15,000 acres of land in the township of Bartlemy. 2,500 were placed in trust, and in 1972, the remaining 13,000 were then placed in trust. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 encouraged the reestablishment of tribal governments by tribes across the nation. The tribe could adopt a new constitution provided by the U.S. government or draft their own. Within the boundaries of their old reservation, Stockbridge-Munsee maintained a town government. And in 1931, this body created the Stockbridge-Munsee Business Committee, so the precursor to our tribal council. In 1937, we drafted and approved a new constitution. Under the leadership of Carl Miller, who is the photograph at the top, the Stockbridge-Munsee reorganized under their tribal government and regained federal recognition. Using federal funds through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the tribe managed to buy back over 15,000 acres of land. Today, currently, the Stockbridge-Munsee community have around 1,500 of enrolled tribal members, 900 of whom actually live on the reservation. And the photograph at the bottom is of Arvid E. Miller, who was tribal leader for 26 years, who was instrumental in the founding of the Great Lakes Intertribal Council and the National Congress of the American Indian. So who are the Stockbridge-Munsee today? Well, they are the largest employer in the county that they live in. They have a land base that's just under 25,000 acres, an enrollment of around 1,500, again, with around 900 of them living actually on the reservation. The department that I used to head, but a department that I encourage you to donate to that helps keep this history alive, is the Cultural Affairs Department, which consists of the Arvid E. Miller Memorial Library and Museum, which houses the largest set of Mohican archives in the world, in addition to objects of cultural significance. You have the Historic Preservation Office, which is located in Williamstown, Massachusetts, which is tasked with preserving and protecting sites of cultural significance in our homelands, in addition to repatriating ancestors from museums and objects of cultural significance. We also have the Language Revitalization Program, where the community is unique in the fact that they have two official languages, Mohican and Munsee. Munsee revitalization has been around since the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where some of our community members traveled to Moraviantown in Canada to learn the language and bring it back to the community. The Mohican revitalization is something that's newer and it's been around in the past few years. There are language classes that I believe you can sign up for to take that and to learn Munsee language. Right. I'm not going to speak for the nation because I don't work for them anymore, but there's a lot of great work going on there. And I will let everyone know that the photographs on this slide were actually taken pre-pandemic. During pandemic, we did a lot of things online, and you can follow the Cultural Affairs Department on Facebook at the Arvid E. Miller Library, Museum, and Cultural Affairs Department. And then I also just want to leave you with this. This is our many trails symbol. It was created by Edwin Martin, who is a Stockbridge Mohican man. And the many trails symbol signifies strength, hope, endurance, and survival. And every line of this symbol means something, whether it's the circles that signal our council fires, whether it's the straight lines that show the many trails that we've been on, whether it's the cross that you can see in the center that signify Christianization of us converting to the Christian religions, or the half circle at the top symbolizing hands in prayer. The symbol, if you see it on somebody's car, if you see it on somebody's shirt, you automatically know that it relates back to the Stockbridge-Munsee community. So with that, I will give you some resources that I think are really good that you could read to learn more about the Stockbridge-Munsee people and Indigenous people in general. You've got A Nation of Statesmen, which talks about the diplomatic history of the Stockbridge-Munsee community. The Mohicans of Stockbridge, which talks about our time in Stockbridge. The Mohicans and their land and The Mohican World, 2 separate books by Shirley Dunn. They're very good to have. And then for an overall history of Indigenous people, I recommend An Indigenous People's History of the United States, in addition to The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer. So I hope that I was able to give you some information that you did not know. Maybe you're leaving today knowing something you didn't know, or maybe strengthening the knowledge of something you already had. And I look forward to any questions that you might have. And thank you so much for sharing a bit of your afternoon with me. And I look forward to continuing to work with the Clark and everyone else. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather, so very much for sharing your history with us. Really incredible presentation. And I invite all of our guests today to enter questions in our Q&A function on Zoom, and I will gladly read some of these for Heather. And Heather, I have a question just to kick things off as the questions start rolling in. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your new role at Forge Project, and just about what Forge Project is, what are you doing there? And yeah, maybe we could start there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to talk about Forge Project. So Forge Project is a new initiative located in the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok River Valley. We understand that we are operating on the ancestral homelands of the Moh-He Con-Ne-Ok people. Forge Project consists of many different facets. And so one is raising the awareness of contemporary Indigenous artists. Right? There are some really awesome contemporary Indigenous artists out there who don't get the same notoriety or acceptance as non-Indigenous artists. So we want to create a space that allows Indigenous artists to be able to be seen and to be heard. And so with that, we have purchased a number of really great works by Indigenous artists that will act as a lending collection to art institutions, so a lending and learning collection. So we can have these works of art put on display in many different areas. We also have a fellowship program that is awarded to Indigenous people who are working in cultural revitalization, land justice, and climate action. So we understand that that work is difficult, and you sometimes might not always have a space or area to do that work. And so that is something that we are doing as well, in addition to working on decolonization programs, creating think tanks around language revitalization, land back, and all these other great things that are going on. So I'm really excited to be here in my homelands, working for Forge Project and bringing some awareness to issues that are going on in Indian country.
Wonderful. I look forward to coming to visit you there very soon, as soon as you're settled from your move, of course.
Yeah.
Heather literally just arrived, so we're extremely grateful for your time. So the questions are coming in. Here's one. Are there any Mohicans living in Berkshire County today?
Living in Berkshire County? I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, but I mean, there are several of us who live in New York State, and there are, people who come out and make, homeland trips.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. In a Smithsonian publication, the tribe is referred to as the Mohican, M-A-H-I-C-A-N, and states it should not to be confused with the Mohegan of coastal Connecticut. Do you know the sources of the spelling differences between Mohican versus Mohican, and which spelling does the tribe prefer?
Mohican, M-A, is closer to the pre-colonized version. M-O is more anglicized. And yes, not to be confused with the Mohegans, who are a completely separate tribe. Everything that the tribe uses when they talk about Mohican Nation is MO.
Great, thank you. Okay, so lots of questions. Many comments saying thank you for a wonderful presentation, by the way. Someone asked, how does one find out their Indigenous lineage heritage if they don't have access to a community nearby?
I mean, it's gonna take a lot of work on your end. Like you've gotta put the effort in, reach out to the Native nations. You have to put together a family tree. So you're gonna want to look into your own genealogy. But yeah, you might not be near a community like that's super accessible, but you should be able to access resources online.
Great. So Heather, where is the Historic Preservation Office in Williamstown located? Who else from your community is located in this region? The Wisconsin community is the largest employer. What do they do? So a few questions there.
Yeah, that's quite a few questions. The Historic Preservation Office is located on at Williams College in Williamstown. We do have people who come out from Wisconsin to visit the homelands all the time. There are a few of us that do live out here. I now live out here, even though, again, I do not work for the community anymore, but I, definitely am a descendant of the community. So I'm not sure total numbers where how many people are out here, but I know of a few of us that are. And for being the largest employer in Shawano County, we do operate a casino that employs hundreds of people. So we take that role very seriously.
Yeah. So one guest writes, you talked about the act that was supposed to protect Native American sovereignty. I'm listening to a podcast called This Land, which talks about current threats to sovereignty. Do you feel sovereignty is protected?
I feel sovereignty is in danger. I am listening to This Land again for like the third time because I was doing research on ICWA, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act that Rebecca Nagel talks about in season 2. And so I'm listening to all the episodes like again for the third time. If you haven't, I encourage you to do so. If ICWA falls, the threat to tribal sovereignty goes up because it's fragile. And I know she touches on this in the podcast, but they're saying ICWA is unconstitutional because it discriminates people based on race. But Native people are not race-based. We are political entities because we are sovereign nations, right? So there's a difference in that. And so if ICWA goes down, it is the first domino that could threaten tribal sovereignty altogether. So I do think tribal sovereignty might be safe right now, but I do think we're in danger.
Thank you, Heather. So here's a question that's really specifically about our area here in Berkshire County. It's both of the rivers here in Berkshire County have names considered to be of indigenous origin, the Hoosic and the Housatonic. What do you know about these names and how might we translate them?
I actually do not know a lot about those names, but I encourage you to check with the language department at Stockbridge-Munsee, and they should be able to help you.
Great. So what resources are there for learning your indigenous language if your family does not speak it?
Check with the tribe of the language you're trying to learn. I know Stockbridge-Munsee does online classes, but I do know that other tribes Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, which I am part of, actually has an app that you can put on your phone. So there's different resources that different tribes can do. So I would just encourage you to go to the website or contact the indigenous tribe whose language you're trying to learn and see what resources they have.
Great, thank you for that advice. Okay, here's another one. For several years until about 2019, I would drive from Rochester to Norwich, New York, driving south of the city of Oneida through New Stockbridge. There was a billboard announcing the Stockbridge-Munsee Nation. Do you know what happened to it? Presumably,
I don't, because I didn't even know about a billboard.
I did not either, but interesting. Okay.
That is interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting.
And okay, we have many questions, but I think we're running out of time. Someone asked, is the recording of this great presentation going to be shared? I believe that is the case. And thank you, Heather. And finally, and I think a nice way to round things out, someone said, how do we find out more about the Forge Project? Is there a website or is there something you can learn more?
You can go to forgeproject.com, and you can also follow us on Instagram at forgeprojectny.
Wonderful. Well, Heather, thank you again. I've learned so much, as I do every time I listen to you speak. And we thank you for being so generous with your knowledge and your history. And we are so glad to have you in our area, our neighbor, and can't wait to have you to the Clark. And I can't wait to visit you at the Forge Project. And thank you, everyone, for your really thoughtful questions and for tuning in. and have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And Heather, take care. And I hope you get some rest after your move.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.